Charles Darwin is perhaps one of the most fundamental and world-changing figures in all of human history. Many argue that this change falls into the positive category, others the negative category, though both sides have reasons for their claims. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, England. The 19th century was a monumental one for a myriad of reasons, and Britain played the predominantly leading role. Napoleon and the French were defeated at Waterloo shortly after Darwin's birth, unsurprisingly to British forces. In the next 85 years brought extraordinary change, unimaginable just decades before. Britain led the way in industrialization, which radically transformed production of goods and introduced widespread machinery to the world for the first time. Social reform also played a huge part with workers, including children, who received much better conditions compared to the appalling state of affairs they had faced before. Slavery was abolished as well, mostly due to William Wilberforce's unceasing efforts in Parliament. Out of this period of tumultuous change, Darwin emerged to force a change of his own. Darwin grew up in an old town that dates all the way back to medieval times. Shrewsbury, in eastern England, was situated on the border with Wales, and it was a charming town filled with beautiful architecture, along with a river and hills in the outskirts, highlighting its peaceful isolation from more urban centers such as London. Descending from a line of physicians, both Charles' father, Robert Waring Darwin, and his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, worked lifelong careers as physicians, perhaps suggesting a similar intellectual prowess for young Charles. Charles deeply admired his dad, and maybe he would have made a good doctor himself, who knows, but there are two reasons he did not. One, he got very queasy when he had to actually work on human psychology, and even one time he fainted during one of his lab experiments during college. Another reason, he just wasn't that interested in it, and so his career would have never taken off anywhere. On the other side of his family, however, things looked quite different. Charles' mother, Susanna Wedgwood, was daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, who actually took part in the Industrial Revolution and the pottery sector. Very different from a doctor. Tragically, Charles' mother passed away from a mysterious stomach illness when he was only at the fragile age of 8. Though historians don't know exactly what caused his mother's death, many point to stomach ulcers or some kind of stomach cancer, though we'll never know for sure. And although Darwin had a number of people who influenced him in various ways, the most important were two men. John Stevens Henslow was one of them, and he was a professor of mineralogy as well as botany at Cambridge University. Darwin received his undergraduate education here, and Henslow was also well versed in botany. This is what appealed to Darwin and what started their friendship. Darwin took Henslow's courses multiple times and enjoyed speaking with Henslow to the extent that students began associating the two as one, as they would go on long walks around the campus and discuss many aspects of botany and mineralogy. Henslow, however, was a very religious man and differed from Darwin, who later developed evolutionary beliefs denying the existence of God. Although Henslow believed that flora could change within species, he later anything beyond this was speculative and unfounded. Interestingly enough, Henslow was actually the man who recommended Darwin for his trip on the HMS Beagle, which would radically transform Darwin's thoughts for the remainder of his life. The other deeply influential figure was John Sedgwick, a professor of geology also at Cambridge University. Sedgwick was also like Henslow in that he resisted Darwin's later evolutionary beliefs. Both men were very religious in comparison to Darwin. However, Sedgwick played a role in motivating Darwin to be fascinated with geology, especially after a geological trip Darwin and Sedgwick took through Wales, in which Darwin was very fascinated with the subject and decided to explore it a little bit more. Inspiring both his fascinations with botany and geology, these men played major roles in Darwin's later beliefs, even if indirectly. Charles Darwin had a unique personality that, along with mentors and family, shaped his future endeavors. Throughout his life, Darwin was an avid reader and kept mostly to himself. You could say he was an introvert, though he was obviously able to form meaningful relationships like we just discussed. He was also very agreeable and kind to those who knew him, even skeptics. Darwin was very curious and loved to learn about almost anything scientifically related, whether it be human psychology, animal behavior, plant life, and its many species, or anything in between. When converting this curiosity to writing, he was very detailed, often to the extreme, and this could occasionally lead to downsides, such as insomnia. He would recount times when he couldn't stop thinking about one of his projects or one of his research notebooks and he just couldn't sleep. Another downside, maybe less related to his work, was severe depression that could hit at times, especially after the tragic passing of his daughter when she was very young. Despite these drawbacks, Darwin went on to achievements that would change global thinking forever. His first major achievement paved the way for subsequent ones in the form of his voyage on the HMS Beagle. While studying at Cambridge, Darwin went from medical aspirations like his father to theological aspirations to be a clergyman, which his father also endorsed, but all the while he had a great interest in science, and he always did from childhood. His father wasn't very keen on this idea, but Darwin decided to push ahead anyways, and thanks to his mentor Henslow, he was hired as the official naturalist of the trip on the HMS Beagle, which would go all the way to South America from England, and that would take a very long time. Mainly, he studied off the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of Ecuador, but I'll let Peyton get into that. Essentially, it formed many of his underlying beliefs that would kind of morph later into what he wrote about. He finally returned back to England after 5 years sailing the world, and again, Peyton will get into that later. But the seed was already planted. Darwin returned in 1836, but it was not until 1859 and after years of research that Darwin finally published his groundbreaking work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, in which he put forth his main argument for animal and plant macroevolution, which could transform a species into possibly a different species unrecognizable from the one that came before it. And he formed this book and made all the observations he had noted and added to for decades. This is Darwin's most famous work and has radically shaped the world since its publication more than 150 years ago. His third and final initiative was his work, The Descent of Man, which focused on man's evolution from prehistoric monkeys and its implications. These two works formed the basis for social Darwinism, a racist and harmful ideology used for evil, especially mass murder and the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, which would take place in the next century. Although Darwin had other works, these two are the most important to his central beliefs in evolution, and these are the ones that we will discuss today. Perhaps one of the most underlying abilities unique to Darwin is his incredible persistence in poring over his notes and his research. Keep in mind, Darwin studied for over 20 years after his return from the Galapagos Islands and before he published his first work. Although his ideas are hotly debated to this day, there are many things he got incorrect, but his willingness to set his ideas to the fire and work tirelessly on them was a positive trait that should be universally admirable, I think, to all college students wishing to work hard. Another ability I think is important to go over is his attention to detail. Without such detail included in his reports, his arguments would have not been very successful, and they would have been rejected more than they already were in Victorian England, which was somewhat hostile to his newfound beliefs. But he made sure to back up his arguments with plenty of evidence, even if faulty. He never glossed He never glossed over small facts that may seem irrelevant because he deemed each factor of his argument and observations important to the underlying theme. In doing so, he was holistic as well, which enabled the public to understand in broader terms the arguments he was trying to put forward and made possible the teaching of his theories in public education as it would going forward. Darwin thought ahead to what would work for his fellow scientists and colleagues, as well as the average layman, so both could understand what he was trying to say. And for this forethought and preparation, he deserves to be applauded. Now I will leave it to Peyton to finish Darwin's analysis.
Before Darwin, most people in Europe and much of the world believed all species were fixed and unchanging, created exactly as they appear today. The dominant worldview was theological and not scientific. In 1831, at the age of 22, Darwin embarked on the journey that would change both his life and the course of science, the voyage of the HMS Beagle. This was a 5-year expedition around the world during which Darwin acted as a naturalist, collecting fossils, plants, and animal specimens from regions far like South America, the Galapagos Islands, and Australia. The Galapagos Islands is where Darwin made some of his most significant observations. He noticed that the finches on each island had slightly different beaks, adapted to the types of food available, some for cracking seeds, others for catching insects. He began to suspect that species were not fixed but could change over time in response to their environment. These observations planted the seed for what would later become one of the most revolutionary scientific theories in history. After returning to England in 1836, Darwin spent over 20 years analyzing his data, performing experiments, and studying thousands of species. He wanted to be sure before he announced the findings to the world. Finally, in 1859, he published his book, On the Origin of Species. In it, Darwin proposed theory of evolution by natural selection. The main idea from his book was organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Those with traits better suited for their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, these advantageous traits become more common in the population. In other words, nature selects which traits are passed on, hence the term natural selection. Darwin's theory provided a natural explanation for the diversity of life, removing the need for supernatural creation. It unified biology and set the stage for modern genetics and ecology. In 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man, where he applied evolutionary theory to human beings. He argued that humans and other primates share a common ancestry, a claim that deeply shocked Victorian society. In 1872, he followed up with the expression of the emotions of man and animals, which explored how emotions evolved as adaptive traits, showing that behaviors like fear, joy, and anger have biological roots shared across species. These works extended evolution beyond physical traits to include behavior, emotion, and even social interaction, ideas that have since shaped fields like psychology and anthropology. Darwin is not only an evolutionary thinker, but also a naturalist. His other works included Structure of Distribution of Coral Reefs in 1842, The Variation of Animal and Plants Under Domestication in 1868, and The Power of Movement in Plants in 1880. These studies showed that Darwin's experiments included extensive observation and experimentation. When On the Origin of Species was published, it caused an immediate uproar. Many religious groups saw it as a direct attack on the biblical account for creation. One famous debate took place in 1860 at Oxford University between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and biologist Thomas Huxley, known as Darwin's Bulldog, for his fierce defense of evolution. Despite controversy, the scientific community gradually came to accept Darwin's ideas. His work provided a framework that made sense of countless biological observations that had previously seemed random. However, not all interpretations were positive. Some people misused Darwin's ideas to justify racist and classist ideologies under the name of social Darwinism, claiming that human societies, like animals, should allow only the fittest to survive. These distortions were deeply unethical and went against the humanistic spirit of Darwin's actual writings. Darwin himself never believed in these applications. On the positive side, Darwin's theory completely transformed science. Evolution became the cornerstone of modern biology, influencing everything from medicine to genetics to ecology and paleontology. This idea also inspired new ways of thinking in psychology, education, and even theology, forcing humanity to reconsider its place in the natural world. Darwin's method of careful data collection, testing, and skepticism set a high standard for scientific research. His willingness to change his mind when evidence demanded it remains a model for researchers today. On the negative side, as mentioned, others twisted his ideas into harmful societal and political theories. Terms like survival of the fittest were misapplied to justify inequity, imperialism, and even eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These misinterpretations caused real harm and were not Darwin's true intent. Over time, as science advanced, Darwin's ideas were not only validated but extended upon. The discovery of DNA in 1953 by Watson and Crick provided the missing mechanism that explained how traits were inherited, something Darwin could only guess at. This led to what scientists called the modern synthesis of the 20th century, combining Darwin's natural selection with Mendel's genetics. Today, the theory of evolution is one of the most well-supported scientific principles ever developed. Darwin has become one of history's biggest scientists, often mentioned alongside Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. His face appeared on British currency, and his home is now a museum. Historians today explore how his Victorian background influenced his views and how the work intersected with colonial attitudes at the time, but overall, his reputation under historical examination remains positive. Darwin did more than propose a biological theory. He changed how humans see themselves. Before him, people believed humanity stood apart from nature, created in perfection and unchanging. After Darwin, we began to understand that we are part of the same grand story of life, shaped by the same natural forces that govern every other living thing. He replaced mystery with wonder, showing that nature's complexity arises not from magic, but from simple processes unfolding over spans of time. That idea continues to resonate today. So, what can we learn from Darwin's life? Charles Darwin did not set out to change the world. He simply followed his observations to their logical conclusions. Yet in doing so, he revolutionized science, challenged dogma, and revealed the beautiful, dynamic story of life on Earth. As Darwin himself once wrote, "There is grandeur in the view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into few forms, or into one, and that, whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being evolved." Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great week.